They laughed at the poor mechanic's bet until the owner returned with a shocking reward. Before we start the story, write in the comments from which part of the world you're watching today. At 7:23 on Tuesday morning, the phone rang, the morning that would change everything. Jack Brennan almost missed it until he heard a voice that made his hands shake. "Mr. Brennan, this is Preston Montgomery. I'm standing outside your store right now with people who want to meet you. What you did to the Ferrari V12 engine changed everything." Through the grimy garage window, Jack saw 3 black SUVs and men in expensive suits. That's because 2 weeks ago, he accepted an incredible $50,000 bet from a stranger named Connor Davis to rebuild the engine of a 1973 Ferrari Daytona that 7 different mechanics had deemed completely unrepairable, unaware that it belonged to Preston's deceased son, David, or that his success would set off a chain of events that would change not only his failing auto shop and his daughter's future, but the entire struggling town of Steelton, Georgia. A quick pause before we continue. Tell us where you're watching from. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe because tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. 2 weeks ago, the morning sun cast long shadows across Gearworks Boulevard as Jack Brennan unlocked the gate to his auto repair shop. The metal creaked in protest, like everything else in his life these days. Paint was peeling from the concrete walls, and oil stains showed decades of hard work on the cracked floors. The sign above the entrance read, "Brennan's Auto Repair. Honest work, fair prices." Though Jack wondered how much longer those words would mean anything. He flicked the switch on the fluorescent lights, and half the bulbs flickered while the others stayed stubbornly dark. Another expense he couldn't afford. The morning ritual continued as he turned on the old coffee maker. The gurgle was the only sound in the vast room that smelled of motor oil, metal shavings, and fading dreams. "Morning, Mr. B," Mason Garcia's voice called from the doorway as the young man wheeled his bike in. At 28, Mason had been working at the shop for 3 years, ever since Jack had caught him trying to steal a car from the parking lot behind Rita's diner. Instead of calling the police, Jack had offered him a job. "Morning, Mason. How's your grandmother?" "Better, thank you. The meds you helped pay for are working." Mason hung his helmet on a hook and grabbed his overalls from his locker. "What's on the schedule today?" Jack glanced at the entry, a notebook whose pages were more blank than filled. "Williams is bringing her Buick in for an oil change around 10. Eddie Patterson needs the transmission checked out, but he's still deciding if he can afford the repairs." Reality hung heavy between them. Eddie Patterson, like half the people in Steelton, was struggling to make ends meet. The steel mill had closed 2 years ago, taking most of the town's good-paying jobs with it. People were hanging onto their cars longer, patching and praying, rather than making proper repairs. Jack understood. He was doing the same with his business. "Mr. B, I was thinking." Mason pulled on his work boots, the laces frayed but still holding up. "Maybe we should expand our services. I was watching a YouTube video on hybrid repair, and there's good money in that." "With what capital, Mason? We can barely pay the lights." Jack's voice carried the weight of 3 months' back rent, a daughter heading off to college, and a bank balance that was growing more daunting with each passing day. The bell above the front door rang, and both men looked up as Connor Davis walked in. He looked to be in his 30s and was dressed in clean but modest clothes. Dark jeans, a button-down shirt that had seen better days, and work boots that suggested he was mechanically minded. It wasn't his appearance that struck Jack, but the way he carried himself, like a man accustomed to being in control even when he was trying not to show it. "Are you Jack Brennan?" "It's me. How can I help you?" Connor glanced around the shop, his eyes taking in every detail. The organized tool rack, the clean workbenches despite their age, the methodical way the parts were sorted and labeled. "I hear you're good with engines." "Been working on them for 27 years. What's your problem?" "It's not really a problem, more of a suggestion." Connor reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. "How would you feel about making $50,000? Mason dropped the wrench he was holding. It clanked onto the concrete, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. Jack felt his stomach clench. In his experience, offers that started with large sums of money usually ended badly. "Depends on what I have to do to get it." "Repair the engine." There has to be some kind of engine to get that kind of money. Connor smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. A 1973 Ferrari Daytona V12. Some say it can't be fixed. Jack had worked on Ferraris before, when he was younger, and the shop attracted clients from the Atlanta area who had the money to buy exotic cars. The Daytona was a legendary car, a front-engine Grand Tourer with a temperamental but beautiful V12 that could make grown men cry when it worked properly. What's wrong with it? 7 mechanics tried to rebuild it. 2 of them were factory-trained Ferrari specialists. They all gave up. Connor placed the envelope on the workbench. This is half the money. You get the rest when the engine runs. And if I can't fix it, you keep $25,000 for trying. Mason stepped closer, his eyes widening. $25,000 was more than they made in 6 good months. $50,000 would save the shop, pay off the bank, and get Ava the college she deserved. What's the catch? Jack asked. In his experience, deals that seemed too good to be true usually were. No catch, just a time limit. 2 weeks, 2 weeks to rebuild a Ferrari V12 engine that 7 other mechanics couldn't fix. Right. Jack studied Connor's face, looking for signs of deception. The man's expression remained neutral, professional. But there was something else there. Desperation, maybe, or grief. Whatever was driving the offer, it was deeper than money. Where's the engine? I'll send it over this afternoon, along with all the documentation from previous attempts. Documentation, work orders, parts lists, diagnostic reports, everything. Other mechanics have tried. This is unusual. Most people don't keep detailed records of botched repairs, especially ones that cost them money. Someone really wanted this engine rebuilt to create a paper trail of everything that didn't work. I need to know more about the car's history, any crash damage, any modifications, anything that might affect the rebuild. Connor nodded approvingly. Smart questions. The car was in an accident 3 years ago. Single car, driver error. The impact damaged the engine mounts and cracked the block, but those are all repairable damages. The engine was running before the accident. Running well, in fact. The driver, Connor's jaw clenched almost imperceptibly. No, sorry, thank you. Silence hung between them, heavy with consequence. This wasn't just about rebuilding an engine. It was about something deeper, more personal. Jack had seen it before with customers who brought in cars that belonged to people they'd lost. Sometimes fixing a car was the only way to heal a heart. Mr. B, Mason's voice was barely audible. $25,000 just for trying. Jack took the envelope. It was thick, solid, real money for real work. But taking it meant taking on something that had already broken 7 other mechanics, including the experts. Why me? Jack asked. If the Ferrari experts couldn't do it, what makes you think I can? Because you're not an expert. You're a mechanic. Connor's voice was respectful, not condescending. The experts know what's supposed to work according to the manual. You know what really works in the real world. It was a distinction Jack understood. Factory training taught you to replace parts by the book. Years of experience taught you to find creative solutions when the book got it wrong. I need to see the engine before I decide. Okay, it'll be here by 3. Connor started for the door, then stopped. Jack, the people who own this engine, they're good people. They've carried this weight for 3 years. If you can lift it, you'll do more than just fix a car. After Connor left, Mason stood staring at the envelope as if it might disappear if he looked away. Mr. B, we've got to take this job. It's not that simple. Mason, if 7 mechanics couldn't do it, there's probably a good reason. But $25,000 just to try, that'll pay the rent for the rest of the year. Jack knew Mason was right. They were 3 months behind on all their bills, and Carol Morrison at the bank was coming up with more and more frequent reminders about the mortgage payment. Ava had been accepted to Georgia Tech, but without the money to go to college, she'd be working at the diner like her mother had before she died. Let's see the engine first and then decide. The rest of the morning was spent doing routine maintenance, oil changes, brake pads, simple repairs that would put food on the table but wouldn't save the business. At 2:45, a flatbed truck pulled into Gearworks Boulevard, hauling what looked like a small crane and some wooden crates. The driver was a professional freight forwarder who clearly regularly hauled expensive cargo. He handled the boxes with practical care, using a crane to lower them into the workshop. After he left, Jack and Mason stood looking at the 3 wooden crates that contained either their salvation or their greatest mistake. "Well," said Jack, reaching for the crowbar, "let's see what $50,000 looks like. This story has taken us a long time to research and publish, so if you like it, please subscribe to our channel. It's very important to us." And now, back to the story. The first crate revealed a Ferrari V12 engine block, and Jack immediately understood why 7 mechanics had abandoned it. The aluminum casting was cracked along 3 separate stress lines that ran like a spider's web from the cylinder head's attachment points to the crankcase. Metal fatigue from the crash had created cracks that would normally require complete replacement. Except Ferrari hadn't made this particular version of the block since 1975. "Jesus," Mason whispered, running his fingers over the damaged surface. "How are you even going to fix this?" Jack knelt next to the engine, his trained eye following the crack lines. "You can't fix it the way the manual says. You have to fix it the way the laws of physics require." He pointed to where the cracks intersected. "See how they spread apart?" This wasn't just a blow. The engine was already overloaded before the crash. The second crate contained cylinder heads, an intake manifold, and an assortment of internal components that told a story of failed attempts. Some of the parts were clearly new, spare pistons still in their packaging, a rebuilt crankshaft with machining marks indicating recent work. Others showed signs of multiple rebuilds, clogged bolt holes, machined surfaces. "Look at this." Mason held up a connecting rod. Someone had tried to balance it by hand grinding. That's why the engine had fallen apart from vibration. The third crate contained a treasure trove, 3 binders of documentation. Jack opened the first and found detailed photographs, diagnostic reports, and handwritten notes from every mechanic who had attempted to rebuild the engine. Ferrari's technicians focused on getting everything back to factory spec, replacing parts that were within tolerances but ignoring the fundamental stress issues. Independent mechanics tried various tricks, none of which addressed the root cause. "They'd all made the same mistake," Jack said, leafing through the reports. "They were treating the symptoms, not the disease." The bell rang when Tony Romano walked into the shop. At 62, Tony had taught Jack most of what he knew about engines in his early years at Romano's import shop. Arthritis had forced Tony into semi-retirement, but he still consulted on complex work and remained the closest thing Jack had to a father after his own father died. "Heard you got something interesting going on here." Tony's cracked hands were already reaching for the engine block. "Connor Davis said you might need some advice. You know, Connor, we've met before. A good man carries a heavy load." Tony examined the cracks with the same methodical approach he'd taught Jack decades ago. This was David Montgomery's engine. The name hit Jack like cold water. Montgomery, as in Montgomery Industries, the company that had bought and closed the steel mill. The same Montgomery family that half the town blamed for Steelton's economic collapse. Preston Montgomery's son. His son, David. The kid was 22, a genius engineer. Liked fast cars more than was good for him. There was a sadness in Tony's voice, the sadness of watching a young man make a fatal mistake. The engine was his project. He'd spent 2 years modifying it. Custom camshaft, balanced internals, electronic fuel injection lifted from a newer model. That explained the stress cracks. It was making more power than the block was designed to handle. 350 horsepower from an engine designed for 260. David was good, but he was young. Thought he could beat the laws of physics. Mason looked at the 2 older men. "So crash speed," Tony said simply. The guy took the turn onto Route 41, doing 90 in a car designed for 70. Probably didn't feel a thing. The shop was silent except for the tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of traffic on Gearworks Boulevard. Jack studied the paperwork again, now understanding why Connor had been so precise about the 2-week deadline, why the money was so important, and why 7 mechanics had failed. They weren't just trying to fix an engine, Jack said. They were trying to fix a tragedy. "And it couldn't be done," Tony agreed, "but you might be able to build something better than what came before." The front door opened again, and Ava Brennan walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee from Rita's diner. At 16, she was already demonstrating the mechanical intuition that ran in the Brennan family. though she had planned to study engineering rather than follow her father into the repair business. "Thought you might need some caffeine." She handed Jack one cup and offered the other to Mason. "Dad, Mrs. Morrison from the bank called. She wants to see you tomorrow morning." Jack's stomach clenched. Carol Morrison only called for meetings when the news was bad. What time? 9 Tau. She'd said to bring the loan papers with him. The weight of the Ferrari project suddenly felt even more pressing. This wasn't just about proving he could fix what others hadn't. This was about saving everything he'd built over the last 15 years. "Ava, I need you to do something for me. Call Dr. Wells at the community college and ask her if she's still teaching that materials science course." "Why?" "Because I think we could use some expert advice on aluminum welding." Tony raised an eyebrow. "Thinking about welding those cracks?" "Not welding, rebuilding. If we were going to fix this engine right, we needed to incorporate David's modifications while also fixing the structural problems he'd created." Over the next hour, Jack and Tony hatched a plan that would have horrified Ferrari's engineers, but made sense to mechanics who'd spent decades doing the impossible. Instead of trying to return the engine to factory specs, they'd embrace David's vision while correcting his mistakes. "First thing," Jack said, sketching on a pad, "we need to relieve the stress concentrations. These cracks follow the center lines of the cylinders, because that's where the peak combustion pressures are. So we machine the ports to relieve the stress." Tony nodded. "Redirect the forces to stronger areas of the casting. Then we use the cracks themselves as expansion joints. We fill them with a material that can bend without breaking." "This is not standard practice." Mason said. "Standard practice has failed 7 times, Jack said. "We'll do something different." By 4 they had a preliminary plan and a parts list that would cost $18,000. Money Jack had no money to spend, but he had to put it up to make the remaining $25,000. It was a gamble that could save his business or ruin it. "I've got some calls to make," Jack said. "Tony, can you stay with the engine? I don't want him left alone. You're going to sleep with him if you have to." The next few hours passed in a flash as Jack worked the phone, calling suppliers, former customers, and anyone who would provide credit for parts. The Ferrari community was small and specialized, but Jack's reputation for honest work had earned him connections that were now proving valuable. Mike Sullivan of Atlanta Motorsports agreed to sell him pistons at cost. Dr. Patricia Wells of the community college offered access to her metallurgy lab for stress analysis. Even Eddie Patterson, whose transmission overhaul had been delayed, volunteered to help with the work in exchange for learning advanced engine techniques. By closing time, Jack had secured commitments for most of the parts he needed and enough volunteers to attempt the impossible. The financial risk was still enormous, but the plan was coming together. "Are you sure about this, Mr. B?" Mason asked as they closed the shop. "If it doesn't work, we'll be broke doing something incredible, instead of broke doing nothing." Jack looked at the Ferrari engine, now covered by a tarp but still dominating the space. "Besides, I think David Montgomery deserves to see his vision properly completed." As they walked to their cars, Tony paused. "Jack, there's something else you should know about Connor Davis." "What is it?" "He's not just a middleman. He worked for Preston Montgomery for 12 years until David died. He was the guy's race car mechanic. So it was personal for him too. More than personal. Connor blamed himself for not stopping David from overworking the engine. He'd carried that guilt for 3 years, just like Preston had." Jack now understood why Connor had seemed so desperate beneath his professional exterior. This wasn't just about rebuilding an engine. This was about 3 people trying to find peace after a tragedy that had shattered their lives. The evening air was thick with moisture as Jack drove home. His mind was already working through the technical challenges ahead. Repairing the cracks would require precision welding, followed by heat treatment to relieve the stress. The electronic fuel injection system would require a complete recalibration for the changed displacement. Internal balancing would take days of painstaking work. But for the first time in months, Jack felt something he had almost forgotten. The excitement of a challenging job that would require every skill he had developed in nearly 3 decades of working on engines. He stopped for dinner at Rita's Corner and found half the town buzzing with the mysterious Ferrari delivery to Brennan's body shop. Rita Patterson herself brought him her usual coffee and meatloaf. Heard you were on to something big, Jack. News travels fast. In a town this size, faster than gossip, she lowered her voice. People are rooting for you, you know. We all want to see you succeed, even if it was working on the Montgomery project. Rita's expression hardened a little. Preston Montgomery was not popular in Steelton, but she was too diplomatic to say so outright. The sins of the father are not the sins of the son. That boy, David, was different from his old man. As Jack ate dinner, he realized that the whole town was watching this project. Success would prove that Steelton still had craftsmen capable of world-class work. Failure would confirm what many already believed, that the best days were behind them. The stakes were higher than $50,000. The meeting with Carol Morrison had gone exactly as Jack expected, terribly. She sat across from him in the bank's sterile conference room. The loan documents lay between them like evidence in a trial where the verdict had already been reached. "Jack, I've known you since high school. I don't want to do this, but the board is pressuring me," she said with genuine regret. "You're 4 months behind on your business loan and 3 months behind on your mortgage. The numbers don't lie. I have a job that will bring in $50,000. When? In 2 weeks. Carol sat back in her chair. "Jack, you've been saying next month for 6 months. I need something specific." Jack reached into his jacket and pulled out Connor's envelope, still thick with $25,000 in cash. Carol's eyes widened as he opened it on the table. "That's the down payment. I'll get the rest when I finish the job." "What job?" "A $50,000 job in Steelton. The kind no one else can do." Carol studied the money, clearly calculating. "That covers your immediate expenses, but what about next month and the month after that? If I do this, word will get out that Brennan's auto shop can do impossible things. And if I don't, Jack," she met his gaze, "you'll still have the money and I'll figure out something else." 30 minutes later, Jack walked out of First National with his loans cleared and a 90-day grace period. It wasn't a lifesaver, but it gave him a reprieve. The real pressure now came from the ticking clock. 12 days to do what 7 mechanics had failed to do. When he returned to the shop, he found Mason and Eddie Patterson carefully disassembling Ferrari cylinder heads under Tony's watch. Overnight, the work area had been transformed into something resembling an operating room, with bright work lights and clean white tarps covering every surface. "How did it go with the bank?" Mason asked, his eyes still focused on the delicate valve train. "So far, so good." Eddie whistled softly. Must be some kind of job to make Carol Morrison smile. She wasn't smiling, more like a stay of execution. Dr. Patricia Wells arrived at 10 Khan with equipment that looked more like it belonged in a lab than an auto body shop. A handheld ultrasound scanner could detect flaws in the metal that were invisible to the naked eye. And her stress analysis software could help predict how the modifications would affect the engine's longevity. "This is fascinating," she said, running the scanner along a cracked engine block. "The cracks tell the full story of the forces that destroyed this engine." On her laptop screen, color-coded stress maps showed how combustion pressures were concentrated in weak spots in the casting. David's modifications increased power, but the added stress exceeded the fatigue limit of aluminum. "That's the problem," Dr. Wells said, pointing to the red areas on the stress map. These bolt holes were designed for the original power. When David increased combustion pressure, the forces had nowhere to go but through these failure points. "So we're strengthening the weak points," Jack said. "Not just strengthening, but redistributing. If we add material here and there," she indicated specific spots, "we can create new load paths that spread the stress over a larger area." The solution was elegant in its simplicity, but complex in its execution. They would machine precision channels into the block, then fill them with a specially formulated aluminum-bronze alloy that was both stronger and more flexible than the original material. The result would be an engine block that could handle David's power modifications without the structural failures that plagued the original. By noon, they had a full metallurgy plan and a parts list that made Jack's stomach churn. The special alloy alone would cost $4,000, and that was just the beginning. "I know a guy," Tony said, looking over the requirements. "He tunes race cars in Charlotte. He owes me a favor since he was 20. "What kind of favor?" "The kind that saved his marriage and his business. He'll help." While Tony made the call, Jack and Mason began the painstaking process of measuring each component. Ferrari tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch, and David's modifications had pushed some dimensions beyond factory specs. Each piston, connecting rod and bearing required individual attention. "Mr. B, look." Mason held up one of the pistons, pointing to the faint marks on its crown. "Those aren't crash marks. That's detonation damage." Jack examined the pits carefully. David was using too much ignition timing. The engine was destroying itself before the crash. Then repairing the cracks won't be enough, not even close. "We'll have to rebuild it from scratch, but we'll have to do it right this time." A stream of customers began trickling into the shop after lunch. Word had spread through the tight-knit community of Stilton that Brennan's was trying something special. Rita Patterson dropped by with sandwiches and stayed to watch the precision measuring process take place. Father Miguel Rodriguez blessed the engine, half-jokingly suggesting that it might need divine intervention. The biggest surprise came from Billy Torres, owner of a rival body shop across town. Jack and Billy had maintained a professional rivalry for years, competing for the same customers in a market too small to comfortably support both shops. "I heard you took the Montgomery job," Billy said, eyeing the disassembled engine with professional interest. "News travels fast, especially when people are hoping you'll fail." Jack looked up from his work. "What about you?" Billy paused for a moment. "My dad worked at the steel mill for 37 years. When Montgomery Industries closed it down, he never found another job that paid half as much. He picked up one of the damaged pistons, turning it in his worn hands. But this guy, David, he wasn't like his dad. The guy would bring his car into my shop sometimes, ask questions about engine tuning. He was trying to learn the right way." "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you need parts, I have a contact in Miami who specializes in Ferrari engines. No markup, just cost." "Why are you helping me?" Billy set the piston down and looked straight at Jack. "Because if you can pull this off, it'll prove that small-town mechanics can still do world-class work. It's good for all of us." By 4 p.m., the shop was a hub of unusual collaboration. Dr. Wells had set up her equipment in a corner, running continuous stress tests on every component. Tony was coordinating parts shipments from 3 different states. Eddie Patterson was mastering precision measurement techniques that would help him in his future work. The real breakthrough came when Mason discovered something in David's engineering notes. Detailed drawings, tucked away in the back of one of the binders, that showed an entirely different approach to internal engine balance. "Look," Mason said, spreading the drawings out on the workbench, "David wasn't just making more power. He was trying to reduce vibration by changing the firing order." Jack studied the complex calculations. "The guy was more sophisticated than I thought. This isn't just tuning. This is serious engineering." "But the other mechanics didn't understand what he was trying to do," Dr. Wells added, peering over Jack's shoulder. "They rebuilt it to factory specs and undid all of his improvements. That's why it kept breaking down. They weren't fixing David's mistakes, they were erasing his innovations. That discovery changed everything. Instead of fixing David's work, they had to complete it. The young engineer was on the right track, but he died before he could complete his ideas. 3 years later, Jack had been able to honor David's vision by fixing the execution problems that had led to the tragedy." "This is going to take longer than I thought," Jack said, examining the complexity of David's modifications. "How much longer?" Mason asked. "If we do this right, absolutely right, we'll need every minute of the 2 weeks Connor gave us." That evening, Jack sat in the kitchen, reviewing David's engineering notes, while Ava, at the other end of the table, worked on her college applications. The young man's handwriting showed a methodical mind, wrestling with complex problems, trying to push the boundaries of what was possible with 1970s technology. "Dad, you've been staring at these papers for an hour now, not turning a single page, just thinking about the engine, the guy who designed it. He was probably brilliant, but he was working alone. If he'd had experienced people to guide him, he might still be alive." Jack nodded. "Experience matters, Ava. Knowledge without wisdom can be dangerous. Is that why you're so careful about everything? When you're working with forces that can kill people, caution is not an option." Ava closed her laptop and moved to the chair next to her father. "Tell me about this engine. Really? Tell me." Over the next hour, Jack explained the technical challenges, the social pressures, and the pressure of working on a dead man's dream. Ava listened with the focused attention she'd inherited from her mother, asking questions that tapped into her engineering intuition. "So you're not just fixing an engine," she finally said. "You're finishing what David started." That's the right way to look at it. Mum would have understood. Grace Brennan had died of cancer 2 years earlier, but her influence on Jack and Ava remained strong. She believed in finishing meaningful work, in honoring commitments even when they became difficult, in finding a purpose beyond mere survival. "She would have told me to take this job," Jack said. "She would have told you to do it right, no matter the cost." That night, Jack dreamed of engines and equations, of a young man's ambition and an older man's responsibility to make it happen. He woke at dawn with a clear vision of what needed to be done. The real work was just beginning. The special alloy arrived from Charlotte at 6 a.m., driven all night by a driver. Jack signed the invoice while Mason and Eddie unloaded the $50 of aluminum bronze ingots that would either save the project or ruin it. $4,000 of metal, Mason said, picking up one of the ingots. "Like holding rent money." "Like holding opportunity," Jack corrected. But his stomach confirmed Mason's assessment. Dr. Wells arrived with her portable welding equipment and a stern expression. "Before we begin the metallurgy, I want you to understand something. This alloy requires precise temperature control. Too hot, it becomes brittle. Too cold, it won't bond properly. Less than 50-degree margin of error. How precise does precise have to be? Readings every 30 seconds. Controlled atmosphere, preheat and post-heat. This isn't backyard welding, Jack. This is materials science." The first attempt at welding stress relief channels was a disaster. Despite careful temperature monitoring, the weld cracked during cooling, wasting 6 hours of prep and $300 in alloy. Jack stared at the failed weld, feeling the weight of dwindling time and resources. "What went wrong?" Eddie asked. "Thermal expansion mismatch," Dr. Wells explained, examining the fracture under magnification. "The alloy expanded faster than the aluminum block during heating." "Then we're stuck." "No, we're learning. That's what prototypes are for." Tony came up with a solution that went against every modern welding textbook, but made perfect sense to anyone who had worked with dissimilar metals for decades. Instead of trying to match the coefficients of thermal expansion, they would deliberately exploit their mismatch, creating a controlled tension that would actually strengthen the joint. "It's counterintuitive," Tony explained, doodling on a napkin from Rita's diner. "But if we pre-stress the alloy in the opposite direction, the thermal expansion will bring it into perfect tension when the engine reaches operating temperature." "It's either genius or insanity," Dr. Wells said. "Sometimes there's no difference," Jack replied. The second attempt took 14 hours. Working in shifts, they heated the engine to precisely 847 degrees Celsius, applied the alloy in several thin layers, then controlled the cooling cycle with thermal blankets and careful timing. When the final weld cooled, ultrasonic testing revealed a joint stronger than the original casting. "Holy Mary and Joseph," Tony whispered as he studied the test results. "We really did it." The victory was short-lived. Although the stress relief passages were perfect, measurements of the cylinder bores revealed another problem. David's modifications included larger pistons, which required machining the bores beyond the standard dimensions. Previous mechanics had tried to fix this by installing bushings, but the bushings had shifted during the crash, creating uneven compression ratios. "We'll have to remove all the bushings and start over," Jack said, measuring the bore distortion. "But that means machining the block to the next oversize, and there aren't any pistons for that," Mason added, consulting their parts catalogs. "Then we'll make them." Eddie looked up from cleaning the valve springs. "Make the pistons from scratch." "It's been done before," Tony said. "We made everything from scratch during the war. There's no reason we can't do it now." The piston project required resources Jack didn't have and expertise that was pushing everyone to the limit. Dr. Wells contacted a colleague at Georgia Tech who specialized in precision machining. Billy Torres gave her access to his shop's CNC milling machine after hours. Father Miguel convinced the church board to loan her the money for the raw aluminum, calling it an investment in community pride. "The whole town is betting on you," said Rita Patterson, bringing coffee and sandwiches into the increasingly cluttered shop. "Half the people in the diner have never seen a Ferrari engine." But they're watching this project like it's the playoffs. No pressure, Jack muttered. But he was touched by the support. Machining of the pistons began on day 8 of the 2-week deadline. Working from David's original specifications, modified for the new bore sizes, they turned raw aluminum into precision components on equipment borrowed from 3 different shops. Each piston required 16 hours of machining, and they needed 12 pistons to account for failures. The first piston came off the machine perfectly, but failed the 30,000-inch dimensional inspection, a microscopic error that would have caused catastrophic engine failure. The second piston was perfectly accurate, but developed cracks during strength testing. The third piston met all specifications and passed all tests. 9 more, Mason said, studying the schedule. That's 48 hours left, and each piston takes 16 hours. Then we'll work shifts around the clock, Jack said. I'll take midnight to 8. Tony, can you do 8 to 4? These old bones can take whatever they have to take. Dr. Wells volunteered for the 4 to midnight shift, despite having a college teaching job. My students can wait. This is more important than theoretical metallurgy. The shop became a 24-hour operation. Neighbors dropped off food at all hours. Mason's grandmother sent over homemade soup. Father Miguel stopped by at midnight to check on the work and stayed until dawn, learning how to operate the ultrasonic equipment. On the 10th day, disaster struck again. A power surge from a thunderstorm damaged the CNC machine's controller, threatening to end the project when 2 pistons remained unfinished. Billy Torres drove to Atlanta in the rain to borrow spare parts from a friend at a race shop, returning at 3 a.m. with components that didn't quite fit but could be modified. Why? Jack asked as Billy crawled under the car to install a new controller. You're losing sleep and money to help the competition. Because 37 years ago, my dad helped build this town's steel mill, Billy said, still working. When it closed, a part of this town died with it. But if you can make this Ferrari sing, maybe we'll prove that Stilton still builds things that matter. The final pistons were completed with 18 hours to spare, but installing them revealed another problem. David's connecting rods had been lightened and balanced, but the balance was incomplete. Each rod was a different weight, creating vibrations that would tear the engine apart at high revs. He ran out of time, said Tony, weighing each rod on a precision scale. He must have died before he could finish balancing it. Then we'll finish it for him. Balancing the rods required equipment the shop didn't have, a specialized machine that could remove material in precise quantities from specific locations. The nearest shop with the right equipment was in Birmingham, Alabama, a 4-hour drive each way. With 16 hours left before Connor's deadline, Mason volunteered to make the trip. I'll drive over now, get there when they open, wait for the job to be done, and drive straight back. It's a big risk. Everything about this project was a risk. While Mason raced to Birmingham with a box of connecting rods, Jack and the team began final assembly of the engine components that could be installed without the connecting rods. The cylinder heads were installed with new gaskets. Torqued to David's specifications rather than the factory settings. The valve timing was set according to David's notes, which called for more aggressive overlap than Ferrari had originally designed. It's either going to run like a dream or it's going to blow up, said Tony as he installed the custom-welded oil pan. David's notes were pretty detailed, said Dr. Wells as she double-checked the timing. He knew what he was doing, theoretically. It was just that the execution wasn't complete. Father Miguel stayed in the shop all night, partly to help and partly to witness what he called the resurrection of a dream. As dawn broke on the final day, he held an impromptu service with Jack, Tony, Dr. Wells, Eddie, Rita, and 6 other neighbors who had been monitoring the project. Lord, bless the work of these hands and the memory of the young man whose vision we seek to complete, Father Miguel said. Let this engine run, not in anger or pride, but in honor of human ingenuity and the bonds of community. Amen, they all said, even Tony, who had not been to church in 20 years. Mason called from Birmingham at 10 a.m. The connecting rods are done and they're perfect, but there's a problem. What problem? My car broke down in the garage parking lot. The transmission is completely out of order. Jack's heart sank. 8 hours until the deadline, and their critical components were stuck 4 hours away. I'm calling around to find a ride, Mason continued. Someone's got to be heading toward Georgia. How long will it take? I don't know, Mr. B. I'm doing the best I can. As Jack hung up, he realized that the project that had brought the community together could be derailed by circumstances beyond anyone's control. With 8 hours to go, all they could do was wait and hope Mason found his way home. The longest day of Jack's life was about to get even longer. At 11:30 a.m., Mason called with news that would change everything. Mr. B, you're not going to believe this. There's a guy here with a helicopter. With what? A helicopter. Says he heard about our situation on the radio. He's offering to fly the connecting rods to Steelton. Jack's knees buckled. Who is this? His name is Captain Hayes, retired military, runs medical transport flights. He said sometimes people needed help, and this sounded like one of those times. 2 hours later, the distinctive hum of spinning blades echoed down Gearworks Boulevard as a civilian medical helicopter landed in an empty lot next to the shop. Half the town gathered to watch Mason emerge with the precious crate, followed by the bright-haired pilot, who offered payment. Plenty of gas money, Captain Hayes said, as Jack tried to hand him the envelope. They said on the radio you were trying to finish a young man's job. My son is about that age. I'd want someone to help him if he needed it. The rods were perfect, balanced to within half a gram in all 12 cylinders. David's original marks were etched into each rod in his neat handwriting, and the Birmingham shop had met those specs to the letter. 6 hours to deadline, said Tony, checking his watch. Can we fit 12 rods, pistons, and get this thing running in 6 hours? We'll find out. The final assembly was a ballet of precision and urgency. Jack and Tony worked on opposite sides of the engine, fitting pistons and rods in a carefully calibrated sequence. Dr. Wells monitored the torque settings, while Eddie and Mason prepped the ancillaries. Father Miguel, who had become remarkably adept at organizing small parts, laid out the bolts and gaskets in the exact order they would be needed. Fit piston 7, Jack called out, guiding the connecting rod onto the crankshaft journal. Torque 65 foot-pounds, then a quarter turn. Confirm 65 and A4, Dr. Wells replied, checking her calibrated spanner. By 3 p.m., the engine was mechanically complete, except for the fuel injection system, David's most significant modification. The original Ferrari used 6 Weber carbs, but David had developed his own electronic fuel injection system, adapted from a later model. His notes included detailed wiring diagrams and fuel maps, but translating 3-year-old papers into a working system required educated guesswork. This is where it gets interesting, Jack said, studying David's wiring diagrams. He was trying to get the fuel delivery right across the rev range, but computer technology hadn't caught up to that level yet. What do you mean? Mason asked. He had the right idea, but his tools were limited, like trying to paint the Mona Lisa with paintbrushes. The fuel injection computer was a custom-built David housed in a military surplus electronics case. Inside, the circuit boards revealed the work of a man who understood programming, but had to improvise solutions with 1970s components. Look at this, Dr. Wells said, tracing the connections on the main board. He hand-wired feedback loops that wouldn't become standard until the 1990s. This guy was 20 years ahead of his time. But did he run it? According to his test logs, the system ran for 47 minutes before it crashed. Not enough time to fully debug the program. With 3 hours remaining, they had a choice: install David's experimental fuel injection system and risk failure, or upgrade the engine with carbs that would work, but would alter David's vision. We'll stick with his design, Jack decided. If we're going to honor him, we'll do it completely. Installing the fuel injection required connecting 63 individual wires according to David's diagrams, calibrating 12 injectors, and programming the computer with fuel maps that existed only in handwritten notes. The errors wouldn't be apparent until they tried to start the engine, and there wouldn't be time to fix them. Wire 37, blue with white stripe, connects to injector bank 2. Cylinder 3 signal, Jack read from David's notes as Mason made the connection. Affirmative, Mason replied, and moved on to the next wire in the sequence. At 5 p.m., Connor Davis appeared at the door of the workshop. His usually calm expression showed signs of tension as he took in the scene. The engine was fully assembled, the wiring harnesses connected, But there was still no sound of machinery. "How much longer?" he asked quietly. "We're in the final stages," Jack replied, his eyes still glued to the fuel injection computer. "Programming the final fuel maps now." Connor nodded and found a spot against the wall where he could watch without being in the way. His presence added weight to the already tense atmosphere. This wasn't just about proving Jack's abilities, it was about giving Connor and Preston Montgomery some measure of peace. After 3 years of carrying the guilt, a fuel pressure test had revealed another problem. David's fuel pump had been properly sized for the engine's needs, but the pressure regulator had failed at some point during storage. The fuel pressure was fluctuating wildly, making proper injection impossible. "We need a new regulator," Dr. Wells said. "Based on the gauge readings, we need it in under 2 hours." "What are the specs?" Billy Torres asked. He'd arrived an hour earlier with spare gaskets and stayed to witness the completion. Jack read the numbers from David's notes. "Base pressure 43 psi, goes up to 55 with boost." "I've got one," Billy said. "Different brand, same specs." 10 minutes of driving. While Billy raced to his shop, Jack made the final adjustments to the ignition timing. David's notes called for initial timing of 18 degree BTDC, aggressive for a street engine, but necessary for the high compression ratio he'd achieved. "This is going to be a wild ride when it gets going," Tony said, checking the timing light. The guy built himself a race engine disguised as a street car. Billy returned with the pressure regulator and hardware. With 90 minutes remaining, they had all the components in place, but they still had to fill the cooling system, check for leaks, and perform a final check of the system. "Oil pressure is good," Mason reported, reading the gauges as Jack cranked the engine by hand. "No binding, smooth rotation, cooling system holding pressure," Eddie added, monitoring the radiator. "Fuel pressure steady at 43 psi, Dr. Wells confirmed. At 6:15 p.m., everything was ready, except for one final detail. The moment of truth, when they would find out if 3 years of tragedy could be turned into redemption. "Connor," Jack called to the man who had been watching silently for over an hour, "you should do it." "What do you mean?" "Start the engine." David would want someone who cared about him to hear him run for the first time. Connor's hands shook as he reached for the starter button. 3 years of guilt, grief, and desperate hope had led to this moment. If the engine started, it would prove that David's vision had been right, that his death had not been in vain. If it didn't, the dreams would die with him. "Any final checks?" Connor asked. "All done," Jack said. "Just push the button and listen." Connor took a deep breath and pressed the starter. The engine cranked once, twice, 3 times, then fired with a roar that shook the dust from the beams. But instead of the smooth idle they had hoped for, it ran rough, misfiring wildly and threatening to stall at any moment. "Too rich," Dr. Wells said quickly, reading the exhaust analyzer. "The ignition timing is wrong," Tony added, hearing the irregular running pattern. "We have 45 minutes to get it set up," Jack said, already reaching for the adjustment tools. The last hour would determine whether months of work and community support had achieved the impossible, or whether some engines really should remain silent forever. But as the Ferrari V12 continued its rough idle, filling the workshop with the sound of barely contained power, Jack felt something he hadn't felt for many years. Absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was supposed to do. The engine was running, now they just needed to make it sing. The rough idle was deafening in the confined space, but to Jack's trained ear it told a story. The misfires followed a pattern. Cylinders 7 and 10 were running lean, while the others were firing progressively. Richard to the back of the engine. David's fuel injection map was close, but not perfect. "Turn it off," Jack called over the noise. "We need to adjust the individual injector trim." Connor hit the ignition switch, and a sudden silence filled the shop like a held breath. 43 minutes to go. "What's the problem?" Connor asked, his voice tight with worry. "No problem, fine-tuning," Jack replied, already opening David's program notes. "The guy got the base fuel map right, but he hasn't had time to adjust the individual cylinder trims." Dr. Wells studied the exhaust gas analyzer. Cylinders 1 to 6 are running at optimum air-fuel ratio. 7-12 are getting leaner. It looks like the fuel distribution isn't quite even. "Manifold pressure differential," Tony said, nodding in understanding. The rear cylinders are getting slightly less fuel pressure due to flow restrictions in the fuel rail. Jack found David's calibration procedure buried at the end of his notes, a step-by-step process for adjusting the pulse width of individual injectors to compensate for exactly this problem. The young engineer had foreseen the problem, but died before he could implement the solution. "Here's what we do," Jack said, pointing to David's diagrams. "We increase the injector pulse width by 2% for cylinder 7, 4% for 8, 6% for 9, and 8% for cylinders 10 to 12. "How do we make those changes?" Mason asked. Dr. Wells studied the computer interface for the fuel injection system. "These adjustment knobs correspond to individual cylinder settings, but we'll have to run the engine and make adjustments while it's running." "Like tuning a carburetor," Eddie said. "Just like tuning a carburetor, only with 12 individual adjustments instead of one." The engine was started, and Jack began the delicate process of adjusting the fuel flow to each cylinder, monitoring the exhaust temperature and listening to the engine's voice. Years of experience had taught him to hear what each cylinder was doing, to recognize the subtle changes that indicated optimum combustion. "Cylinder 7, he announced, turning the adjuster screw a quarter turn clockwise. The characteristic jerk in the engine's performance had smoothed out a bit. Dr. Wells confirmed this by watching the instruments. The air-fuel ratio was approaching stoichiometric. Cylinder by cylinder, Jack worked through David's calibration routine. Each adjustment brought the engine closer to the smooth idle David had envisioned, but the process was excruciatingly slow. There were 28 minutes left, and they were only halfway through the cylinder bank. "We need to go faster," Connor said, checking his watch. "Rapid adjustments lead to big errors," Tony replied. "Jack knows what he's doing." At 6:47, with 13 minutes remaining, Jack made the final adjustment to cylinder number 12. The engine's idle changed from a rough growl to a smooth, purposeful whisper that seemed to breathe mechanical precision. "That's it," Jack said, stepping back from the engine. "This is what David wanted. The Ferrari V12 engine idle with the controlled power of a sleeping predator. Each cylinder fires in perfect sequence. The fuel injection system delivers precisely measured amounts of gasoline at precisely the right moment. The sound is intoxicating. 12 cylinders working in harmony, creating something greater than the sum of their parts." "Spin it up," Connor said quietly. Jack pressed the accelerator smoothly, and the engine responded instantly. The idle rises smoothly through the rev range, each 1,000 RPM, adding a new note to the mechanical symphony. At 3,000 RPM, the sound was pure music, a baritone growl that spoke of pent-up power and sophisticated engineering. "David would have loved it," Connor said, tears in his eyes. "He did," Jack replied. "That's what he was trying to build." But they weren't done. The bet was that the engine would run, but Jack's professional pride demanded more. David's notes called for the final step, a full throttle test to ensure all systems were working properly under load. "We need to run it through the rev range," Jack said. David's notes called for a 5-minute test cycle to get it up to operating temperature. "Is it safe?" Mason asked. "We're running this in a closed garage." "Open all the shop doors," Jack ordered. "Tony, can you put your truck up to the tailpipe to help suck the exhaust out?" With 7 minutes left on Connor's deadline, they prepared for the final test. The shop doors were open to the evening air, and neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk to witness the end of 2 weeks that had taken over the city. Jack gradually increased the fuel flow, lifting the engine to 2,000 RPM, then 3,000, monitoring oil pressure, water temperature, and exhaust gas readings. The Ferrari responded flawlessly. Every system worked exactly as David had intended. 4,000 RPM, Jack announced, and the engine's voice rose to a controlled roar that echoed off the buildings along Gearworks Boulevard. "Oil pressure stable," Dr. Wells called. "Water temp normal," Mason added. "Exhaust gases normal," Tony confirmed. At 4,500 RPM, the engine had reached what David's notes called the transition point, the point at which his own camshaft and fuel injection settings would deliver maximum efficiency. The Ferrari's response was immediate and impressive. The power was even smoother, and the exhaust note changed from a roar to a controlled scream that spoke of pure mechanical perfection. "Jesus Christ," Connor whispered. I've never heard it run like that. Because it's never run like that, Jack replied, holding the accelerator pedal steady. David died before he could finish the calibration. This is the first time his engine has run the way he intended. For 3 minutes, the Ferrari V12 sang at 4,500 RPM, proving that David Montgomery's vision had been right all along. An engine that 7 mechanics had declared unfixable was running better than it ever had when new. "Keep the revs down," Connor finally said. "It's perfect." Jack gradually eased the fuel back down, and the engine settled into a smooth idle. In the sudden relative silence, they heard the crowd outside cheering. Word had spread through Stilton that Brennan's auto shop was about to do the impossible. "Check the time," Jack said. Mason glanced at his watch. 2 minutes to 7. "We did it," Eddie said, grinning. "We actually did it." "David did it," Jack corrected. "We just finished what he started." Connor walked slowly around the running engine, listening to its perfect idle, watching the gauges that showed every system was operating at optimum settings. 3 years of guilt seemed to lift from his shoulders as he realized that David's latest project had not been a failure. It was just unfinished. "Jack," Connor finally said, "I need to call—" "Who?" "Preston Montgomery. He's been waiting 3 years to hear this engine run properly." When Connor went out to make the call, Jack stood there, listening to the Ferrari idle and feeling something he hadn't felt since his wife died. The complete satisfaction of a job well done. They had taken David's aborted vision and brought it to life, proving that small-town mechanics could achieve results that factory hands couldn't. "Mr. B," Mason said quietly, "what happens now?" "Now we turn it off," Jack said. "We finish it and wait to see what Connor comes up with." "But the engine runs," Mason said. "We've proven it works." "We've proven more than that," Jack said. "We've proven that good ideas don't die with the people who think of them. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right hands to finish them." At precisely 7, Jack reached over and turned off the ignition. The Ferrari V12 died with a final satisfied sigh, its 12 cylinders silent after completing David Montgomery's 3-year journey from tragedy to triumph. In the sudden silence, they heard Connor's voice outside, telling Preston Montgomery that his son's engine was finally working the way it was supposed to. The bet had been won, but Jack suspected the real payoff was yet to come. 3 black SUVs arrived at dawn the next morning, pulling up to Brennan's body shop in a formation like a presidential motorcade. Jack was already in the shop, performing a final check of the Ferrari's engine, when he heard the car doors slam outside. Preston Montgomery stepped out of the lead car, and Jack immediately understood where David got his engineering mind from. At 52, Preston moved with the controlled precision of a man accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands. But in his eyes was the undeniable weight of a father who had lost his only child. Behind him came Connor and 3 other men in expensive suits, like corporate executives. One carried a briefcase that seemed far too important for its size. "Mr. Brennan," Preston said, holding out his hand. "I drove up from Atlanta as soon as Connor called. I had to hear it for myself." "He's ready to go when you are," Jack said, noticing the tremor in Preston's voice. "Before we start the engine, I have to tell you something. Connor probably explained that David was my son, that he died in an accident involving this car. What he didn't tell you was why this project was so important to me." Preston paused, collecting his thoughts. "After David died, I closed his entire engineering lab, stopped all his projects, transferred his staff, destroyed all traces of his work at Montgomery Industries. I was angry at him for dying, angry at myself for not being able to stop him from racing, angry at everyone who encouraged his car interests." "That's understandable," Jack said quietly. "No, it's not. That was the reaction of a grieving father, not a businessman who understood innovation. 3 weeks ago, I found David's personal research notes in his apartment. He wasn't just tuning this Ferrari. He was developing technologies that could revolutionize the efficiency of cars." One of the men in suits stepped forward. "I'm Dr. James Foster from the Georgia Tech Department of Mechanical Engineering. I studied David's work. His fuel injection algorithms and combustion optimization theories were 15 years ahead of current industry practice. Which brings us to why we're here," Preston continued. "Jack, you didn't just fix my son's engine. You completed research that could change the way combustion engines are designed. The question is, what do we do with this knowledge? Jack felt the weight of unexpected responsibility. I'm not sure I understand. Preston gestured to the Ferrari engine, now clean and ready for display. David's modifications have provided a 23% improvement in fuel efficiency while increasing power. Do you realize what that means in today's market? It means David was smarter than he got credit for, Jack said. It means his ideas could save millions of gallons of gas a year if they were applied to production cars, Dr. Foster added. But those ideas died with him until you brought them back to life. Connor spoke for the first time since arriving. Preston, show him the proposal. The man with the briefcase opened it and pulled out a thick, leather-bound document. Jack Montgomery Industries wants to establish the David Montgomery Automotive Research Center here in Stilton. What kind of research center? A facility dedicated to developing practical applications of David's work, Preston explained. We'd hire local mechanics and engineers, train them in cutting-edge automotive technology, and use their real-world experience to bridge the gap between laboratory theory and practical application. Jack struggled to wrap his head around the implications. You're talking about creating jobs in Stilton, he clarified. 40 jobs initially, with the potential to expand to more than 100 within 5 years. Engineering positions, skilled technical work, production support, the kind of jobs this town hasn't seen since the steel mill closed. Mason, who had been quietly sorting tools in the background, dropped his wrench again. Are you serious? He asked. Absolutely serious, Preston said. But there's a catch. We want Jack to run this facility, not as a manager, but as an engineering director. Your job will be to teach young engineers what you know about turning theory into reality. I don't have an engineering degree, Jack countered. You have something better, Dr. Foster said. You have the ability to look at a complex problem and come up with solutions that go beyond the textbook. This is exactly what we need. Tony Romano emerged from underneath the Ferrari, where he had been checking the fluid levels. Jack, you're being offered a chance to turn your life's experience into the foundation of something bigger. What about Brennan's body shop? Jack asked. You're keeping the shop, Preston said. In fact, we want it to become part of a research facility, a place where theories are tested and refined by people who understand how things really work. The offer was stunning, but Jack needed the full picture. What's the catch? Why is Montgomery Industries investing so much money in a town you abandoned when you closed the steel mill? Preston's expression tightened. Because I made a mistake closing that plant. I was focused on quarterly profits, not long-term value. This town has skilled workers, a strong work ethic, and a sense of community. These are assets I was too arrogant to acknowledge. And now I'm trying to honor my son's memory by finishing what he started. Not just the engine, but his belief that innovation comes from combining academic knowledge with hands-on experience. Ava appeared in the doorway of the shop, having walked over from Rita's diner, where she had worked during the summer. Daddy, Mrs. and Patterson said there were some important machines outside. Ava, come here, Jack said. I want you to meet some people. As Jack introduced his daughter to Preston and the others, he watched her display the same engineering curiosity she'd inherited from both her parents. Her questions were smart and pointed, impressing scientists and executives alike. Your father says you plan to study engineering at Georgia Tech, Dr. Foster said. If we can afford it, Ava answered honestly. The Zento Research Center would include a scholarship program for local students, Preston said. Full tuition, plus summer internships with experienced machinists and engineers. Jack watched his daughter's eyes widen at the possibilities, but he also recognized the enormity of the decision he was being asked to make. It wasn't just accepting the job, it was staking his family's future on Preston Montgomery's vision of redemption. I need to hear the engine first, Preston finally said. I need to know that David's work was worth finishing. They started the Ferrari, and for 5 minutes, Preston stood there listening to the perfect sound his son had dreamed of. As Jack revved the engine to its maximum, Preston closed his eyes and smiled for the first time since entering the shop. He'd be so proud, Preston said as Jack shut off the engine. So what's your answer, Jack? Connor asked. Jack looked around the workshop that had been his life for 15 years. the community that had supported him through an impossible project, his daughter whose future hung in the balance, and the Ferrari engine that represented both tragedy and hope. "I have one condition," Jack finally said. "Name it. Everyone who helped with this project gets first dibs on a job at the research center. Mason, Eddie, Dr. Wells, even Billy Torres, if he wants to be a part of it. This was a team effort, and the benefits should go to the community." "Agreed," Preston responded immediately. "Everyone who helped make David's vision a reality deserves to benefit from his success." "Then yes, we will." The handshake that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it changed everything. Within 6 months, construction began on the David Montgomery Automotive Research Center on the site of an old steel mill. Within a year, Steelton had transformed itself from a dying town into a hub of automotive innovation, where theoretical engineering met practical experience. Jack kept Brennan's body shop, but it became a testing ground for young engineers to turn ideas into reality. Mason completed his engineering education through the center's educational program and became Jack's assistant director. Ava graduated from Georgia Tech with a scholarship funded by David's research patents and returned home to work on projects that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with internal combustion engines. But the real victory wasn't measured in jobs or economic development. It was measured in turning tragedy into purpose, failure into innovation, a community's despair into hope. 5 years later, as he watched a new group of engineers install one of David's efficiency modifications into a production engine, Jack thought about the phone call that started it all. Preston was right. What Jack had done with that Ferrari engine had changed everything. Not just for one family, but for an entire town that had learned that sometimes the most broken things aren't hopeless. They just needed the right hands, the right community, and the right understanding of what they were really meant to be. An engine that had been silent for 3 years was now powering research that would improve millions of cars around the world. David Montgomery's interrupted dream became a legacy that would outlive all who remembered it. And in a small town in Georgia, mechanics and engineers worked side by side, proving every day that the best innovations come from a combination of theoretical knowledge and the wisdom that can only be gained from years of working on broken things. The end. Next up, 2 more incredible stories right on your screen. If you liked this one, you won't want to miss these. Just tap to watch and don't forget to subscribe.